The morning after her wedding, Lady Augusta Vere Mortlake sat at the breakfast table at Eastmere House and listened to her new family discuss the weather. Rain was expected before noon. The road south would be difficult. Someone's cousin had written from Bath about the frost. Augusta lifted her teacup and drank, and the porcelain was warm against her fingers, and the fire across the room was perfectly adequate, and none of it touched the cold that had settled somewhere behind her sternum the moment she had stepped into this house as its duchess. She had made her calculation. She had weighed it carefully in the 48 hours between her father's solicitor friend pressing her hand at a dinner party and saying, "There is something you should know about the man you are to marry," and the moment the ring had slid onto her finger. Gently, she had noticed, with a precision that had briefly surprised her. She had made her calculation, and she had stood in that church, and she had told herself she was prepared for anything this marriage might produce. She had not, it turned out, been entirely right. At the far end of the table, Anthony Mortlake, Duke of Eastmere, stared at his plate and said nothing, and Augusta watched him from beneath her lashes and thought, something is about to happen. It happened quietly, as the worst things do. The Dowager Lady Sybil, Anthony's aunt by marriage, had been speaking about the November roads. Anthony's sister Caroline was nodding with the particular attentiveness of a woman who is not listening at all. The two cousins present were occupied with their eggs. 3 members of the senior staff stood in the corridor just beyond the open door, and Augusta had noted their presence from the moment she sat down, because Augusta noted everything. Anthony set his fork down. He did not look at her. He said, in a voice calibrated with terrible precision, quiet enough to be private, audible enough to be public, that this marriage was his punishment. The room went still. Augusta set down her teacup. She set it down without sound, without haste, with the deliberate care of a woman who has decided exactly what she is going to do next. She turned to look at her husband, of less than 24 hours. He was staring at his plate. His jaw was set. He had the look of a man who has just said aloud something he's been saying to himself for days, and who is now waiting for the ceiling to fall. Augusta looked at him for 1 full second. Then she smiled, small, precise, the kind of smile that takes a lifetime to acquire and cannot be counterfeited. "Then consider your sentence served," she said. Her voice reached every corner of the room. It reached the corridor. She rose from her chair. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked past Anthony without looking at him again, past Lady Sybil, who had gone the color of old chalk, past Caroline, whose hand had frozen halfway to her coffee cup with an expression of barely suppressed delight on her face. Augusta walked out of the breakfast room and down the corridor and up the stairs to her own rooms, and she did not once change her pace. Behind her, Lady Sybil said, "Anthony." Just the one word, flat and appalled. Anthony said nothing. In the corridor, the senior staff had apparently found urgent business elsewhere. All 3 of them had evaporated with the swift efficiency of people who know that what they have just witnessed will be repeated at every dinner table in London within 48 hours, and who are already composing their accounts. Augusta's rooms at Eastmere were adequate. She had been shown them the previous afternoon by a housekeeper who had the manner of a woman braced for complaint, and Augusta had offered none, because she was not in the habit of complaining about things she could not yet change. The rooms had good light and a writing table that was too small, and she had already decided to address the second problem within the week. She sat at the writing table now and opened her commonplace book, a thick, battered volume that had traveled with her since her first marriage, its pages dense with notes, references, the occasional sketch of a parish register entry, and lines of personal reflection written in a hand so small it was effectively private code. She dipped her pen. She wrote one line. Either I have made the worst mistake of my adult life, or the most interesting one. I will know by spring." She closed the book. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the cover. She had been told about the legal claim 6 days ago. Her father's solicitor friend, a careful, kind man named Fellows, who had managed the Vere estate's final dissolution and who had known Augusta since she was 9 years old, had taken her aside at a dinner party 2 nights before her wedding and told her, in a low voice and with visible discomfort, that a Mr. Edgar Holcomb had filed a formal claim asserting descent from the Duke of Eastmere's great-uncle through a marriage the Mortlake family had always denied. If the claim was proven, it would strip Anthony of his title. It would also render his late mother's marriage legally invalid. Fellows had told her because he thought she deserved to know what she was walking into. He had not expected her to walk into it anyway. Augusta had thought about it for 2 days. She had thought about it with the same methodical attention she brought to a disputed parish register or a question of contested descent. Which was to say, she had laid out what she knew, identified what she did not know, and assessed the probability of various outcomes. The claim, as described by Fellows, had weaknesses. She could see them from where she stood. The question was whether the man she was about to marry was the kind of man who would ask her to help him, or the kind who would use her without telling her, or the kind who would be too proud to do either and simply lose. She had looked at Anthony Mortlake across a dinner table 3 weeks before their wedding and thought, intelligent, formal, and in considerable pain. Possibly all 3 are relevant. She had married him. And this morning he had said what he said, and she had said what she said, and now London would hear of it before the week was out. And Augusta sat at her writing table and thought, good. Let them hear it. The conversation that matters will happen tonight. She opened her desk drawer and took out the notes she had already begun. He came to her sitting room that evening at 8:30. Augusta heard his footsteps in the corridor. She had already learned the particular rhythm of his walk, the way it slowed slightly before a decision. And she did not turn from her desk. She was writing. She finished her sentence. "Augusta," Anthony said. She set down her pen and turned. He was standing in the doorway, still in his day clothes, which meant he had not dressed for dinner, which meant he had spent the afternoon in his study in the kind of determined misery that precludes domestic routine. He had no paper in his hand. He had come, she understood, intending to speak plainly, and the plainness was already costing him something. "You may come in," she said. He came in. He stood in the center of the room and looked at her, and she looked back, and the silence lasted long enough to become a statement. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me several," Augusta said. "Which one are you offering?" "For this morning," he said. "For what you said, or for the fact that you said it in front of your aunt and your sister and 3 members of your staff?" "Both." "That is not an apology," Augusta said. "That is a category. An apology names the specific thing that was done. What you said this morning was that our marriage is your punishment. I would like to know what you meant by it." Anthony's jaw tightened. "I meant that I had behaved badly in the circumstances that led to this marriage." "Badly toward me specifically, or badly in general?" "Toward you?" He paused. "I used your expertise as a solution to a problem without informing you of the problem." "Yes," Augusta said. "You did. And you have still not told me what the problem is." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. A fractional change. The kind that would be invisible to anyone who had not spent 38 years learning to read what people were not saying. "I did not expect," he said, "that you would—" He stopped. "That I would what?" "That you would be capable of sustaining this conversation," he said. It came out before he had finished deciding to say it, and he heard it land, and his expression showed that he knew exactly how it sounded. Augusta was quiet for a moment. "You should have read my published work," she said, "before purchasing me. I will not refund the bride price, but I think the terms of the arrangement deserve renegotiation." Something happened in his eyes. It was not amusement. It was too complicated for amusement. But it was in the same family. "You have 3 monographs under your name," he said. "I have 4, Augusta said. "The 4th was published in March. Your solicitors were evidently working from an outdated reference." A silence. Then Anthony reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded document. He crossed to her desk and placed it between them without speaking. Augusta looked at him for one moment. Then she picked it up and read it. She read it completely, without expression, without hurry. The fire settled in the grate. Anthony stood across the desk and waited with the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks and has no idea what comes next. Augusta set the document down. "I have known about this for 6 days, she said. "Mr. Fellows told me the night before our wedding, which means I have been on your side for 6 days longer than you have had the wit to notice." Anthony was very still. "The claim rests on 3 pillars, Augusta continued. She took a fresh sheet of her own stationery from the desk. "The first is the assertion that your great-uncle contracted a valid marriage in 1789 that your family suppressed. The second is the baptismal record that Holcomb's solicitors have produced, which purports to document a child of that marriage. The third is the chain of descent from that child to Mr. Holcomb himself." She picked up her pen and began to write. "The third pillar is the easiest to examine and the least likely to be the forgery, which means we begin with the second. We need the original register from which that entry was taken." "Cumberland," Anthony said. His voice was different now. "The parish is in Cumberland, St. Cuthbert's, near Penrith." "Then we will need to go to Cumberland." Augusta wrote the parish name. "The first pillar, the marriage itself, depends on whether there are witnesses or secondary documentation. Who was your great-uncle's solicitor?" Anthony sat down on the edge of her desk. It was not a conscious decision, she thought. His legs simply placed him there because the situation required proximity. "I will find out," he said. "Good." She handed him the sheet of stationery. "These are the first 3 lines of investigation. I suggest we begin in the morning." He looked at the sheet. He looked at her. He said, "You married me knowing about this." "I married you," Augusta said, "because it was the most interesting puzzle I had been offered in 14 years, and because you were the only position from which I could usefully solve it. Whether that reflects well on either of us is a question for another evening." Anthony was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are not what I expected." "No," Augusta agreed. "I rarely am." They bent over the stationery together, and the fire burned steadily, and outside the November wind found the eaves of Eastmere House and tested them, and found them sound. Within a week, Augusta had moved her writing desk into the library. She had not asked. She had appeared one morning with 2 footmen and a crate of reference volumes, and by the time Anthony came down to work, her desk occupied the south end of the library table with the permanence of something that had always been there. He had looked at it for a moment. He had looked at her. He had said nothing. He had sat down at his own end of the table and opened his correspondence. Lady Sybil heard about it by afternoon and sent a note indicating that she intended to discuss the matter at her earliest convenience. Augusta sent back a note inviting Lady Sybil to tea on Thursday. And when Lady Sybil arrived, prepared, Augusta could see, to deliver a structured objection. Augusta had poured the tea and explained, with complete courtesy and no visible awareness that there was anything to be defensive about, that she had been engaged by her husband for her professional expertise and intended to be useful, and that the library was the most practical location for the work in question. She asked Lady Sybil whether she took sugar. Lady Sybil departed 40 minutes later, looking considerably more confused than satisfied, which Augusta considered a reasonable outcome for a first engagement. Meanwhile, letters had begun arriving for Augusta from colleagues, a historian at the British Museum, 2 members of the Antiquarian Society her father had chaired, a solicitor who had used her second monograph in a case the previous year. Word had apparently traveled. The letters were curious and carefully worded, asking in various oblique ways whether the new Duchess of Eastmere intended to continue her professional work. Augusta set them aside. She would answer them when there was something worth answering. London, she heard through Caroline, Anthony's sister, who had taken to dropping in with cheerful informality, had begun referring to them as the dueling Duke and Duchess, which Augusta found both accurate and mildly satisfying. That night, when Augusta looked up from a particularly dense passage of ecclesiastical law, she found that the better reading lamp had been moved to her side of the table. Anthony was reading across from her, apparently absorbed in his work. Neither of them mentioned it. Augusta turned back to her page, and the lamp cast its warm circle over her notes, and the library was quiet. And outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall. November gave way to December in a progression of long evenings and increasingly familiar silences. Augusta taught Anthony to read parish registers. He had a methodical mind, she discovered, and once he understood the system, he was faster than she had expected. Anthony taught Augusta how arbitration procedure worked, the specific language and sequence of a formal hearing, the weight that different categories of evidence carried. She asked precise questions. He answered them without condescension, which she noted. Their conversations moved. She could not have said when the movement began, only that one evening they were discussing the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of a Cumberland parish. And the following evening, Anthony asked her, without particular preamble, about her first marriage. She told him the facts plainly. Married at 21 to a man she had respected and liked. Widowed at 24, 14 years of independent work since. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, she asked him about his mother. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. His mother, he said, had been the kind of woman who made a house feel inhabited. She had died 4 years ago. He still reached sometimes for the letter he would have written her. Augusta thought about her father, who had taught her Latin and paleography and the names of the Norman barons, and who had died believing her mind was the finest thing he had produced. She did not say this aloud, but she understood what Anthony meant. One evening in late November, they argued, with genuine and increasing heat, about whether law and justice were the same thing. Augusta held that they were not and could not be by definition, because law was a human construction and justice was a standard against which human constructions were measured. And conflating the two was the intellectual error that produced the most suffering. Anthony held that in a functional society, the distinction was academic, because without law there was no mechanism for justice at all, and that a scholar who refused to work within the mechanism was choosing philosophical purity over practical result. Neither won. They both went to bed dissatisfied and resumed the argument over breakfast. and it was the best conversation Augusta had had in years. Late one night in the first week of December, Augusta fell asleep over a Cumberland register. She did not intend to. One moment she was reading, the next she was waking with her cheek on her arm and the fire lower than it had been, and something warm across her shoulders. She lifted her head. Anthony's coat was draped over her. He was across the room with his back to her, apparently reading, with the particular stillness of a man who is pretending he has not just done something. Augusta looked at the coat. She looked at him. She said nothing. She pulled the coat a little closer and went back to work, and wore it until they finally closed the books at 2 in the morning. 10 days later, they rode out to a tenant church 6 miles from Eastmere to verify secondary record. The road had been passable. The churchyard was not. The flagstones were sheeted in ice, invisible under a thin layer of overnight snow. And Augusta was 3 steps from the gate when her boot found a particularly treacherous patch and her balance went. His hand caught her elbow. Fast and certain, the grip of a man who has been watching the ground and has already decided what he will do if she slips. He steadied her, and his hand stayed a moment longer than steadying required. She felt the deliberateness of it, the decision in it. And then they were both looking at the church door, and neither of them said anything. Walking back to the carriage an hour later, Augusta took his arm without asking. He adjusted his pace to hers without comment. The carriage ride back to Eastmere was quiet, and not uncomfortably so. Holcomb's lawyer had been watching the calendar. In the second week of December, a formal letter arrived addressed to Anthony, written in the elaborate threatening language that legal men used when they wanted to imply violence while maintaining deniability. The letter suggested that a challenge to the authenticity of the claim would be answered with the public disclosure of certain correspondence relating to the management of the late Duke's estate. Anthony's father's estate, in other words. Implying irregularities that would be damaging to the family's reputation. Anthony read it twice and set it on the library table. Augusta read it once. "He does not have the correspondence," she said. "How can you be certain?" "Because if he had it, the letter would name a specific document and a specific date. This letter names nothing. It implies a category. That is the language of a man who is hoping you will be frightened into settling before he has to produce evidence he may not possess." She picked up her pen. "We will respond in kind. Specifically, we will acknowledge receipt of the letter, note that we are unable to respond to unspecified allegations, and invite Mr. Holcomb's solicitor to produce the correspondence in question at his earliest convenience, at which point we will be happy to address its contents." Anthony looked at her. "You enjoy this?" "I find it clarifying," Augusta said. "There is a difference." They drafted the reply together, and the lawyer received it 3 days later, and no correspondence was forthcoming. Augusta filed the exchange in her case notes under intimidation, unsuccessful December 12th. Lady Sybil's dinner was a different matter. It was a formal evening, 12 guests, the good china, the kind of social occasion that operated entirely on established hierarchy and would have run like clockwork if Lady Sybil had not made 2 precise adjustments. The first was Augusta's placement at the table, seated below her rank between a minor baronet's wife and a cousin, whose name Augusta had not previously encountered. The second was conversational. Twice during dinner, when Augusta had begun to speak, once on the subject of a contested estate case she had consulted on, once on the question of the Cumberland registers, Lady Sybil had redirected the conversation with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had spent 40 years managing rooms. Augusta absorbed it. She did not flinch, did not flush, did not allow her expression to shift by a fraction. She had been managed out of conversations before. She knew how to sit inside the humiliation without letting it show. What she did not anticipate was Anthony. The second redirection had just occurred. Lady Sybil's voice smoothly overriding Augusta's mid-sentence to address a question to the baronet at the far end of the table, when Anthony interrupted his aunt. Not loudly, not with obvious aggression, but with the kind of flat, final clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "I believe Augusta was speaking," he said, "about the Cumberland registers." He looked at Augusta. "You were saying that the ecclesiastical records in that parish present a particular challenge, mates." 12 people heard it. Lady Sybil's face did not change, but her hands, Augusta noticed, settled very carefully onto the tablecloth. Augusta met Anthony's eyes for a moment. Then she continued exactly where she had left off, and finished her point. No one interrupted her again. The dinner ended in civil silence. On the carriage ride back to Eastmere, they did not discuss what had happened. There was nothing to discuss exactly. Or rather, there was everything to discuss, and neither of them had the language for it yet. Augusta looked out the window at the dark road and the hedgerows silver with frost, and something shifted in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time, and she allowed herself privately a small smile. Not dry, not strategic, simply warm. They left for Cumberland in the second week of January, when the roads were hard with frost and the sky had the flat white look of more snow coming. The vicar of St. Cuthbert's, a small elderly man named Hartley, who seemed entirely unsurprised by the arrival of a duke and duchess requiring access to his parish records at irregular hours, showed them to the vestry and brought them tea and asked no questions whatsoever, which Augusta considered the mark of an excellent churchman. They worked through the first night and into the second morning. The vestry was cold, the kind of cold that settles into stone walls in January and does not leave until April, and the candlelight was adequate for careful work, and Augusta moved through the registers with the methodical speed of long practice, while Anthony worked the secondary volumes she directed him toward. She found Holcomb's entry on the second night. "Anthony," she said. He was beside her in 4 steps. She pointed to the line. He read it. He read it again. The entry was a baptismal record from 1791, documenting the birth of a child to one Thomas Mortlake and his wife. It was the entry that underpinned Holcomb's entire claim of descent, and it was a forgery. She could see it in the ink, a slightly different consistency from the surrounding entries, a hairline variation in the pen angle, the characteristic signs of an entry made at a different time from the record surrounding it, by a hand attempting to match the register's existing style. "The ink is wrong," she said. "The surrounding entries are from a single pen. This entry was added later, possibly years later." She looked at Anthony. "Holcomb's claim rests on this. Without it, the descent he asserts cannot be documented." Anthony let out a slow breath. "We need to look at the surrounding years," Augusta said. "The forger would have had a reason. Something was being hidden." They kept working. 3 pages later, Augusta stopped again. She looked at what she had found. She looked at it for a long time, making certain. Then she said his name again, and her voice was different this time. Careful, deliberate, carrying something that was not triumph. He came and looked. The entry was from 1789. A legitimate baptismal record, clearly original, documenting the birth of a child to a man named William Mortlake, Anthony's great-uncle, and a woman named Eleanor Hartley, A child who, according to the subsequent entries Augusta traced through the next 40 minutes of silent, methodical work, had lived, married, and produced descendants. Descendants who were, by the line Augusta was reconstructing on the paper beside her, represented in the present day by a man named Edgar Holcomb. The forged entry of 1791 had been placed in the register to establish a false descent, obscuring the real one. The false descent could be challenged and dismissed. The real one could not. But the forged entry had been placed there by Anthony's late uncle, his mother's brother, a man Anthony had spoken of with uncomplicated affection. Specifically to disinherit William Mortlake's legitimate child and consolidate the title through deliberate fraud. Anthony's title was secure. The forgery proved Holcomb's documented claim was false, but the truth beneath the forgery proved that Holcomb's family had been wronged. They sat in the cold vestry as the light outside the narrow windows began to change from black to gray. The register lay open between them. Anthony had not spoken in 20 minutes. Augusta looked at him. He was sitting very still, and his face had the look of a man who has just watched the ground shift under his feet and is waiting to discover whether it will hold. She crossed to him. She sat beside him on the vestry bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She took his hand, his left hand, which was resting on the bench, and she held it between both of hers and said nothing. The silence stretched on. Outside, a bird began to call somewhere in the bare trees. "He forged it himself," Anthony said at last. His voice was flat with the effort of steadiness. "Yes," Augusta said. "My uncle, who I—" He stopped. Her voice was quiet. "Yes." Another silence. Augusta held his hand and waited. "What does this require us to do?" Anthony asked. She had been thinking about that for the past hour. She told him plainly. They had found evidence of a forgery committed by a member of the Mortlake family. Evidence that Holcomb's documented claim was false, and evidence that a legitimate line had been deliberately suppressed. All three pieces of evidence existed. The question of what to do with them was not a legal question, but a moral one, and it would have to be answered before they went to the arbitrators. Anthony nodded once. He did not release her hand until the light outside had shifted fully to morning gray, and the vicar knocked gently at the vestry door to ask whether they would like more tea. The journey home took 2 days. On the first evening, stopped at an inn while fresh snow made the road impassable. Anthony said that there was perhaps a way to enter only the portion of the evidence that disproved Holcomb's forged claim, and to approach the question of the legitimate line privately, without the arbitration court. Augusta looked at him across the small table in the inn's parlor. "You mean suppress the second part of what we found," she said. "I mean, address it through a separate channel." Anthony: "We found evidence that your uncle committed fraud to disinherit a legitimate heir. If we enter only the evidence that exonerates you and approach the rest quietly, we are choosing which part of the truth to tell. That is not a different channel. That is a lie with better manners." "My mother's name is in those records," Anthony said. "Her brother's fraud. If this goes into the arbitration record, it becomes a public document. Her name, her family." "Your mother's name is already in those records," Augusta said. "It was placed there by the circumstances of her birth. What you are asking me to decide is whether to be the kind of scholar who selects the evidence that serves the client and sets aside the evidence that does not. I have spent 30 years refusing to be that scholar. I will not begin now. I am not asking you to falsify anything. I am asking you to exercise judgment about what is relevant." "All of it is relevant," Augusta said. "That is what the word means." He said that she was indifferent to what full disclosure would cost, that she was treating his family's history as a research problem rather than as people she was connected to now. She said that she was treating it with the only form of respect she knew how to give it, which was honesty, and that if he wanted a wife who would manage the truth to protect his comfort, he had made a serious error of selection. They returned to Eastmere in separate carriages. Augusta took her work to the dower wing and stayed there. She did not slam doors or refuse meals or make her withdrawal dramatic in any way. She simply worked alone in the small sitting room of the dower wing and thought about what she had said and whether she had said it well, and concluded that she had said it accurately, which was not quite the same thing, but would have to do. On the second day, Lady Sybil arrived. She came without announcement, which was her habit, and Augusta received her in the dower sitting room with the courtesy she gave everyone, and waited. Lady Sybil sat down, arranged her skirts, and offered Augusta a face-saving exit. A winter in Bath, a quiet dissolution of the marriage on grounds of incompatibility. No scandal that could not be managed. She said it as a kindness. She almost meant it as one. Augusta looked at Lady Sybil for a long moment. She thought about Bath. She thought about her rooms there, the quiet, the work she could return to, the conversations she would have with people who already knew her and would not require her to prove anything. Her voice was steady. No. Lady Sybil blinked. Augusta. Augusta met her gaze without wavering. No. Thank you for coming. Lady Sybil left. Augusta returned to her desk. She had not declined because of love. She was too careful with words to use that one yet. She had declined because she had looked at the evidence of who Anthony was and what he was capable of, and she was not yet finished with the question. She was not a woman who walked away from questions. On the third day, he came. He knocked. She said, "Come in." He came in and stood in the center of the dower sitting room and looked at her. And she looked back, and he said, without preamble and without defense, that she had been right and he had been wrong, and that he would enter the complete evidence at the hearing, whatever it cost. He turned to leave. Augusta stood up from her desk. She crossed the room in 4 steps and put her hand on his sleeve. He stopped. She kissed him. Once, slowly, with the deliberateness of a woman who has made a decision and is committing to it fully. His hand came up and covered hers where it rested on his arm, and he was very still, and the kiss lasted a moment that neither of them counted. When she stepped back, she looked at him directly. He looked at her. Something had been named between them that had no word yet, but was no longer deniable. "Come back to the library," she said. He came. The 3 weeks before the hearing had the quality of a siege, which was, Augusta thought, entirely appropriate. Holcomb's lawyer sent a proposed settlement, a private acknowledgement of the legitimate line, a sum paid quietly, the arbitration withdrawn. Anthony sent back a refusal. The matter would be decided on the record and in full, or not at all. The Dowager Lady Sybil, in what Augusta later understood was her final move, petitioned to have Anthony declared mentally unsound. Specifically, she cited his decision to permit his wife to give expert testimony in an arbitration proceeding as evidence of impaired judgment. The petition was reviewed and dismissed in 2 days. Augusta heard about it from Caroline, who told her with a particular brightness in her eyes. And Augusta thanked her and went back to her preparation notes. She was rehearsing her testimony in the library on a Tuesday evening. Anthony listening from the other desk and asking the questions she had told him the arbitrators were likely to ask, when she stopped mid-sentence. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Anthony looked up. "Yes," he said. She had expected him to pause before answering, or to qualify it. The plainness of it was different. "So am I," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you afraid of specifically?" "That I have prepared this correctly, and they will still find a way to dismiss it," she said. "That the fact of my sex will matter more to the arbitrators than the fact of my evidence. That I will have been right about everything, and it will not be sufficient." She paused. "What are you afraid of?" "That you will be right about everything," Anthony said, "and it will cost you something it shouldn't, and I will not be able to prevent it." Augusta looked at him for a moment. She picked up her notes. "Then let us make certain the preparation is as good as it can be," she said. They worked until the sky outside the library windows began to lighten, and the fire went to embers, and the case notes were as complete and precise as two people who had spent 4 months thinking about almost nothing else could make them. Doctors' Commons on a February morning had the particular quality of London institutional architecture. Gray stone, high ceilings, the sound of footsteps that had been echoing in those corridors for 2 centuries. Augusta walked in beside Anthony and felt the room register her, assess her, and begin to form its conclusions, all in the space of 10 seconds. She was familiar with the process. The arbitration chamber was not large. The 3 arbitrators sat at the front. Holcomb's legal team occupied one side of the room. She recognized the lead lawyer, a man named Carver, from his correspondence, and he recognized her from her published work, which she could see in the fractional adjustment of his expression when she entered. He had prepared, she thought, for a wife defending a husband. He had not prepared for what was actually coming. Anthony's solicitor presented the formal structure of the case. Carver presented Holcomb's claim. Augusta sat and listened and made 3 small marks in her notes. When it was her turn, she stood. She presented her testimony in 3 parts. The first part established, with documentary precision, that the baptismal entry underpinning Holcomb's claim of descent had been forged. She named the register, the entry number, the date, and the specific physical evidence of interpolation. She had brought a written analysis and offered it to the arbitrators. Carver objected. The arbitrators reviewed it. The objection was overruled. The second part was the one that changed the room's temperature. Augusta stated plainly that the forgery had been committed not by any member of the Holcomb family, but by Anthony's late uncle, Reginald Mortlake, in or around the year 1791, for the specific purpose of disinheriting a legitimate collateral line. She named the legitimate entry. She named the year. She named the child and the subsequent line of descent. She placed the supporting documentation on the table. The room was very quiet. The third part was the one that stopped Carver entirely. Augusta stated that the legitimate collateral line, the one Reginald Mortlake had fraudulently suppressed, was, through a traceable chain of descent she then traced aloud, represented in the present day by Mr. Edgar Holcomb himself, not through the fraudulent claim his solicitors had filed, through the real one which the fraud had been designed to obscure. Mr. Holcomb had come to this hearing with the wrong documentation for a legitimate grievance. She set down her notes. She looked at the arbitrators. "The Duke of Eastmere's title," she said, "rests on the legitimate line from which he descends, which is unaffected by his uncle's fraud. His title is secure. Mr. Holcomb's claim as filed cannot be sustained because the entry on which it rests is a forgery. However, the estate from which Mr. Holcomb's ancestor was disinherited by that fraud represents a genuine wrong, and the court has before it the documentation necessary to address it." Carver sat with his papers in his hands. and said nothing for a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment. The arbitrators withdrew for 40 minutes. When they returned, the ruling was as Augusta had laid it out. The title remained with Anthony. The Holcomb family was entitled to formal restitution from the Mortlake estate, to be calculated from the value of the disinherited share. The late Reginald Mortlake's fraud was entered into the court record. Anthony would lose approximately a third of his fortune. His title and his late mother's marriage were fully vindicated. In the corridor afterward, as Anthony's solicitor was gathering papers and Carver's team was filing out in a silence that would require considerable processing, a man stopped beside Augusta. He was perhaps 50, with a direct, weathered face and the manner of someone who had spent considerable time and money on a fight he was not certain he would win. Edgar Holcomb looked at Augusta and said, "I came into this room expecting a duchess to defend her husband." "I know," Augusta said. "I found a scholar who told the truth that cost her as much as it cost me." He paused. "I am grateful for it." Augusta looked at him. "Your ancestor was wronged," she said. "That is simply a fact. It wanted acknowledging." Holcomb nodded once, with the gravity of a man receiving something he had been owed for a long time. He moved away. Anthony, Augusta realized, had been standing at the end of the corridor, watching, and had not moved. The steps outside Doctors' Commons were flooded with February sun, thin, winter-pale but genuine, the first real sun in weeks. Augusta stood at the top of the steps and let it fall on her face for a moment. Behind her, she heard Anthony's footsteps. He came to stand beside her, not behind her, not at a proper social distance. Beside her, close enough that she could hear him breathe. He said without title and without formality, "Why did you actually marry me?" Augusta looked at the street below, the carriages, the gray-coated figures moving in the cold, the ordinary February city going about its business. "When Mr. Fellows told me about the claim," she said, "I spent 2 days thinking about what kind of man you were, not what I had heard about you, what the situation itself implied about you. You had a problem that required a genealogical scholar. You chose to solve it by marrying one, without telling her what she was being married for." She paused. "That could mean you were the kind of man who treats people as instruments and sees nothing wrong with it. Or it could mean you were the kind of man who knew exactly what he was doing, was ashamed of it, and did it anyway because he was frightened and had no better idea." She turned to look at him. I wanted to know which. Anthony was very still. "Which did I turn out to be?" "The second," Augusta said, "which is recoverable. The first is not." He was quiet for a moment. The sun came through a gap in the clouds, and the street below them went briefly bright. "I moved the reading lamp to your side of the table," he said. 3 days after you installed your desk in the library." "I noticed," Augusta said. "I did not know how else to—" He stopped. "I did not have the language for it yet." "I know," she said. "You do now." He turned to face her, and she let him look at her. And what was in his face was the expression of a man who has just been seen clearly by someone whose seeing he had not known, until this moment, that he had wanted. The library at Eastmere the following morning had the quality of a room that has found its right arrangement after a long period of trial. 2 desks occupied the south end of the library table. Augusta's, installed in November and never moved, and Anthony's, which had migrated gradually from its original position at the north end until it was simply beside hers. The case papers were stacked on the side table, finally closed. The fire, which had been banked the night before, was warm and steady. 2 pairs of riding boots stood by the door, A single tray held 2 cups of tea, both still steaming. On Augusta's desk, a fresh sheet of paper bore the beginning of a new monograph. The title was written at the top in her small, precise hand. On the forensic use of parish registers in questions of contested descent. A case study in documentary evidence and the limits of legal claim. Beneath it, in the space where the dedication would go, she had written one line. Anthony was awake before her. For the first time in their marriage, she had noted, with some amusement, before falling asleep. He sat at his end of the table in the morning light, the dedication page open in front of him, and he read the line she had written. For my husband, who chose the truth when it cost him something. This is what that looks like. He sat with it for a long moment. Outside, the February morning was clear and cold, and somewhere on the Eastmere grounds, a horse was being walked in the early light. And the house was quiet in the way that only houses with people in them are quiet. A living quiet, full of small sounds. Anthony Mortlake, Duke of Eastmere, read the dedication again. Then, slowly and privately, in the way of a man who has not had much practice at it, he smiled.